Okay, so welcome everybody. Uh, this is the second lecture in the series. Last week, we discussed The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And I mentioned that The Wealth of Nations was actually written after, several years after the book that we will discuss today, which is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the reason why I chose to talk about The Wealth of Nations first was because that is by far the more well-known book by Smith. It is, in fact, the work for which he is probably known by everybody who knows the name. The book we will discuss today is much less known, uh, but so therefore it makes sense to talk about the work by which Smith is most well known. In other words, introduce you to the ideas that immediately go with the name of Adam Smith, which is about the idea of commercial society, the division of labor, the increasing productivity of labor, and how that in fact leads to the increasing wealth of nations and the increasing prosperity of even the poorest among the population in commercial society. Now, today, when we talk about his earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I will try to show you that the way in which Smith's arguments in The Wealth of Nations have in fact become sort of reduced to certain universal propositions, sort of law-like propositions in the discipline of economics as it would be formed through the 19th century, and even more in the 20th century, when something called neoclassical economics would in fact claim to derive from certain universally valid law-like propositions said to be introduced by Adam Smith. That actually one misses a great deal, because Smith's arguments were actually placed within an entire intellectual field, an intellectual sort of context, where the modality of philosophical reasoning was not the one which emphasized sort of abstract deductive reasoning from first principles. It was far more empiricist. It was located in very specific historical contexts, in trying to understand the actual experiences of people and what people actually thought and believed when they acted in particular ways. So this was a very different kind of understanding of social reality than what would come, especially from the French and German philosophers that we will read later on. So it is important to understand this particular context, and the context becomes even clearer when one remembers that Smith actually was part of a movement that is known in history as the Scottish Enlightenment. I will talk a little bit about the Scottish Enlightenment today before moving into the actual text of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, because I think that will give all of you a better sense of how Smith actually reasoned, how Smith laid out his arguments. The appeal was not so much to abstract theoretical principles. The appeal was much more to actual human experience and the specific historical contexts of what Smith would call stages of social development. That would be a very important idea that Smith would introduce. So let me move first to the okay. Is the screen visible, Shovik?
Yes, Partha. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the Theory of Moral Sentiments was actually first published in 1859. It went through a few revisions, even in Smith's lifetime. But the broader context, the broader intellectual context, was what is called the Scottish Enlightenment. And three great figures, David Hume, Adam Smith, and Adam Ferguson. Now, the Scottish Enlightenment was a late 18th century movement. It was going into the early years of the 19th century. It shared the humanism and rationalism of the much better known French Enlightenment, which of course, as you will know, the great figures of Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, and so on, in the decades just before the French Revolution. The most important set of publications of the French Enlightenment were the many volumes of the encyclopedia. That was the first great encyclopedia that was compiled. Of course, later we've had many others. The encyclopedia, where the idea was that everything that is worth knowing can be put together in a set of volumes, arranged, in fact, alphabetically or by subject. And that was the entire stock of worthwhile human knowledge. Everything that is worth knowing can be put together in that form. Now, the French Enlightenment, as I said, was hugely influential later on in history in terms of the very idea of modernity, rationalism, the dependence on reason rather than on faith, the decline of religion and the rise of secular modes of thought, reasoning, of art, etc. So the Scottish Enlightenment, they shared many of these characteristics, but its very distinct quality was its empiricism. This is what I was referring to earlier. Empiricism, that is to say, it instead of abstract philosophical reasoning, it depended more on observing actual behavior, actual experiences of people, the distinctions between different stages of society, different national cultures. All of these things were taken into account by the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment when they began to write and speak on subjects like, for instance, morality, on the laws of nature, on how knowledge is to be acquired, how reliable knowledge is to be acquired, and subjects of that kind. So Smith, of course, we have been talking about, and we will talk more. But let me tell you a little bit about Hume, because Hume, in a sense, was influential in Smith's work. He was senior to Hume. Hume was senior to Adam Smith. He wrote his most famous book is called A Treatise of Human Nature. He also wrote a very successful and popular 6-volume history of England. Now, he was what is called a skeptical philosopher, skeptical. He argued, skeptical in the following way. He argued that humans were not born with innate ideas. Instead, the human mind was a bundle of experiences. Now, this is a very important approach to the understanding of human nature. Because unlike many of the rationalist philosophers who thought of human nature or the human mind as having been given a certain innate quality, certain innate ideas which were supposedly implanted in the human mind by nature or by God. I mean, sometimes the origin was attributed to God in the case of those who accepted the idea of God as the creator. But even those who did not, they attributed the source to nature, and that nature supposedly had planted certain fundamental innate ideas in the human mind. Now, Hume definitely did not accept this. He, in fact, said that human beings were born with no ideas at all. There was nothing innate. That the human mind acquired ideas, developed ideas through experience, through the experience of life, all the actual encounters that human beings went through with nature and with others in human society. Those series of ideas constituted the human mind. The series of experience constituted the human mind. There was nothing inherent in this. Now, this will have very important implications in terms of understanding human behavior and how human behavior was to be understood or explained. Secondly, it's not just the human mind. Hume also did not accept the very commonly held idea that nature had certain inherent laws. Hume disputed this. Hume said nature did not have any laws of necessary causation. All human beings can see are repetitive events in nature. They only saw nature behaving in a regular way because the same things happened every time. But here was his very, very, you might say, radical skeptical idea. His argument was that simply because we have seen nature act in a certain way every time that we've observed it, did not mean that nature could not change itself tomorrow. In other words, if you think of some of our most fundamental beliefs about nature, about natural laws. For instance, we all know that the sun rises in the east. Okay, how do we know this? Smith says we know this because every time we or any humans have observed this movement, they have seen the sun rise in the east. And so we assume that's how it's going to be tomorrow and the day after and for all time to come. Smith disputed this by saying that we don't know if nature is going to change its course tomorrow. How do we know that it won't? Right? There is nothing no evidence we have to say that nature actually has some inherent, innate law by which it moves in that particular way. Nature could change. Now, this was a radical idea in the context of the way in which the idea of natural laws, and particularly the understanding of the physical sciences, was developing by Smith's time. This is already the middle of the 18th century. Because by then, the understanding was among those who thought about natural laws, science, don't forget, I mean, by this time Newton has happened, Leibniz has happened, all of this has happened. And so the argument there was that nature actually followed certain fundamental laws, that nature did not do these, did not change from day to day, that nature was not fickle-minded. So all of these things had become part of the philosophical understanding of nature. This had something to do also with the loss of faith in the idea of an all-powerful creator God, right, who could intervene in nature and bring about miraculous events. Now, don't forget, I mean, religion, both Christian religion and most organized religions, in fact, had a strong belief in the idea of miracles. And miracles were events that were supposed to be the result of the intervention of God or God-like agents in nature, where these interventions actually interrupted the normal routine functioning of nature. So, for instance, someone who's, for all practical purposes, someone who was believed to be dead suddenly comes alive, right? This would be considered a miracle. And how did it happen? Because there was no natural explanation for it. The explanation was believed to be the intervention of God. Now, this possibility of God intervening in nature would come in the way of any kind of formulation or understanding of natural laws which were unchanging, which were universal and unchanging. So, for instance, something like, let us say, gravity. Okay, we all know you throw up something in the air, it is bound to come down because of the force of gravitation. That was a law-like behavior of nature. Now, there was no way that an object could be thrown up in the air and the object would keep flying all the way out, or, without end. This simply could not happen. Because if it could happen, if these were possibilities, then of course, as you can see, we could not actually have any faith in law-like regularities of nature. We could not formulate natural laws or laws of nature. And therefore, no physical science would be possible. Because how could you have a physical science where if you could not be sure tomorrow if the force of gravity would be operating, if it didn't operate anymore tomorrow because God chose to intervene, then of course there was no law of gravity. Now, this would be completely disastrous for any possibility of natural science. So natural science for natural science to be possible and for it to be pursued and to gain legitimacy, and in fact become a practical guide for actual human activities, right? Then you would either have to say that there was no God, that there was no creator God, right? And so the question of God intervening would not arise. There was only nature, and nature had its own laws. You would actually have to have this, what would be effectively an atheist position. Most philosophers at this time in Europe would not make that claim for all sorts of reasons. There were social reasons. It was, in fact, very difficult for anyone to claim that one did not believe in God. So there was a position within Christian faith that developed, which was called deism. And the idea of deism was this, that God, in fact, did create the world, that there was nature, nature had been created. God had made nature in such a way that nature would follow certain inherent laws. These laws were God-given. God had given these as the attributes of nature. But having created nature, God does not intervene anymore. Now, this was absolutely crucial. God does not intervene anymore. And because God does not intervene anymore, human beings or the human understanding could proceed to study nature, to follow its course, its actions, its behavior, and formulate, or as it would say, the term was to discover the laws of nature by observation, by induction. All of these things are there are different methods, experimentation. All of these things became part of the practice of science, but they all had to make the fundamental premise that there were no miracles, that God or any godlike agent did not intervene to change the natural laws in any kind of unpredictable way. So that was the deist position. What Hume was saying was far more radical than the deist position. Because what Hume was saying was that we cannot even know if there were natural laws or not. We cannot know it because all we can observe are actual events in the course of nature. All we can observe are certain regularity. That is all. So our knowledge of nature can never be certain because we simply cannot. It's not big, the question was not whether or not there were other forces and so on and so forth which were intervening in laws which were already known. What Hume was saying, that simply on the basis of our experience of nature, and this is where you come back to the first point, right? What is the basis of our knowledge of nature? The basis is simply our experience of the nature, what we see, feel, perceive of nature. That is all that we know. We have no way of going inside nature, right? All that we know is what we perceive. And on the basis of what we observe, there is no way we can have certain knowledge, right? So as I said, the example of such an obviously basic example like the sun rising in the east, a Humean skeptic would say, Hume himself did not give this particular example, gave many others. But a skeptic of that kind would say, well, we are simply proceeding on basis of what is called induction from repetitive events, right? The fact that the event sun rising in the east is repetitive, it happens every day, it's happened for millions and millions of years, and so we can be reasonably confident that it will happen tomorrow. And what the skeptic would say, sure, you can be reasonably confident, but you can never claim that that is a certain knowledge on the basis of your discovery of some innate law of nature, because we simply cannot know such laws of nature. Okay, so that was one very important position that Hume introduced into what was otherwise a fairly clear faith of the new philosophers of Europe. You might say the modern philosophers of Europe, who most definitely had some notion that there were, in fact, natural laws, and these natural laws could be discovered. Hume was raising a very deeply skeptical question about this. Finally, on the question of morality, again, Smith raised a very deeply skeptical doubt. And his argument was that moral behavior, the behavior of human beings, or human ideas on morality, they did not arise from deliberate reasoning, but from custom and habit. So, yes, most people, most of the time, behave in a moral way. They have an understanding of what is moral, of what is the right thing to do, right? They have a notion of right and wrong. And most of the time, most people behave in the right way. But Hume says that is not because everybody reasons about the foundations of morality. They do not actually reason in their minds every time when they act. They do not reason what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do, and make judgments on that basis. They act in a moral way simply out of the force of custom and habit. There could be religious injunctions, there could be education. It's just the way they have been brought up to know or to tell that this is the right thing to do, that is the wrong thing to do. This is proper conduct, that is not proper conduct. Okay? And most of the time, most people behave that way. Even when they behave wrongly, they do so not because they've reasoned out anything. It's simply because, for whatever specific reasons, they choose to act against custom, or it may be that they have been improperly educated. They have not been sufficiently educated in the prevailing moral habits. And so morality, again, would become a matter of practical, or you might say, a moral of social practice or custom, rather than one of the faculty of reason. Okay. Now, all of these were the foundations of what we might call, or has been called, a very strongly empirical tendency in Scottish Enlightenment thinking. It would have a very important effect on what would broadly be called British social theorizing and social ideas through the 19th and 20th centuries. You know, so-called strongly British empiricist tradition in social thinking. Smith's early work is very strongly influenced by Hume. There are several instances where Smith actually refers to David Hume's work. And we'll see immediately in what ways Smith's foundations of his understanding of morality, what he's calling moral sentiments, is indebted to, to Hume. The other figure is Adam Ferguson, who was younger than Smith. Ferguson's major work was called The History of Civil Society. That term, civil society, of course, you are all very familiar with these days. He was the one who first introduced this term. And the idea of civil society was precisely a notion of the way in which social institutions and practices were related to something called civilization, right? Civilized behavior, civilized forms of social interaction. And Ferguson was important. You can see similar ideas in Smith too. He was important because he introduced a notion of the progress of human society through stages. There was a stage of development idea. Now, remember, this was well before the rise of Charles Darwin and the idea of evolution. It's well before Darwinism. But there is an idea of social development from savage society, hunting societies, to civilization, civilized society, and finally commercial society, the society in which had arisen in the towns and cities of Europe by the 17th, 18th centuries. And in Ferguson's term, this progression through stages was mainly caused by improvements in techniques and machinery. He did not specifically talk about the rise in productivity of labor caused by division of labor, which was, of course, Smith's fundamental argument. Smith, too, as we've recognized already, had a notion of stages of development. We'll see more of it today. Ferguson was basically describing this progression as a result of better techniques of production. So, for instance, from hunting to agriculture, he mentioned the emergence of new tools that were developed. And because of these new tools, it was possible to, let us say, farm the land, which of course hunters had not been able to do. So it was a more elaborate argument than this very rudimentary idea. But another important aspect of Ferguson's ideas of the stages was that he believed that the virtues of sociability and community in civilized society had been lost in commercial society. So in that transition from what was the broadly civilized societies of, let us say, medieval Europe, to the rise of the new commercial towns, right, where there was clearly a great deal of increase in wealth. But Ferguson thought that the commercial cities were dominated by selfishness, and the old virtues of community and social feeling had been lost. So Smith or Ferguson was not really a straightforward, uncomplicated, progressivist thinker. he did believe that material progress in some ways could be accompanied by a certain moral regression, a moral decline. And so that introduces another interesting aspect into, it would be repeated later on. For instance, when you see Romanticism developing in the 19th century with the rise of industrial cities and industrialism, there would be an argument that certain kinds of virtues of pastoral society, of rural life, had been lost and could not be found in the great bustling industrial cities. And so there was romantic art and romantic poetry, etc., etc. You would have this later on too. So let me move then to the actual text of the theory of moral sentiment. Do you have any questions about the Scottish Enlightenment? Okay, so let's move on into the text. So recall that in The Wealth of Nations, one of the key arguments that Smith was making about human nature was the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Okay, that he highlighted as a key aspect of human nature. It was this tendency in all human beings to exchange things so that what one had, which was in excess of what was needed, could be exchanged with others who had more of what we needed. And therefore, through exchange, barter, etc., all the parties would be benefited. This, of course, was absolutely the key to Smith's idea of the market, and hence why division of labor would in fact contribute to the increasing wealth of everybody. Now, but in this book, which was, as I said, an earlier work, Smith emphasizes not this propensity to exchange, but the sentiment of sympathy. Now, we will discuss later as to whether the idea of self-interest, which seems to dominate the wealth of nations, and sympathy, which is the key idea in moral sentiments, whether these are actually contradictory or not. It's an interesting and important question, but we'll discuss that later. Second, morality is a social fact produced by habits and has social effects. Now, this is where you can clearly see the shadow of David Hume falling on Smith, that morality for Smith, again, is because of a certain adherence to custom and habit, rather than a deliberate action caused by reason. We will see how Smith makes this argument. Then human society moves along stages of development. We have already encountered this argument earlier in The Wealth of Nations. We will see this again here. And finally, and this is a very interesting argument that we will see in Smith, that morality is functionally related to the particular stage of social development. In other words, Smith is not making an argument about morality, which is, or principles of morality, which are universally valid for all human beings in all societies. He is making distinctions between what would be appropriate moral behavior in a particular stage of social development, so that what is moral for in savage society may not be moral in civilized society. What is moral in civilized society may not be moral in commercial society. And these values, in other words, change. And there was no absolute principle or scale of values. Values change. The justifications that are offered for particular kinds of behavior are change according to the particular social context, or more specifically, according to the functions of those moral actions within that particular society. We'll come to this idea of functions later on, specifically when we discuss this question. So, what is sympathy? This is laid out in the very first chapter of the book. I didn't ask you to specifically read this short chapter, but maybe you could do it once we've finished this lecture, because the very first sentence of the book, part 1, section 1, chapter 1 of sympathy. So the first sentence goes like this: how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Okay? So, the first thing that Smith is saying here is that human beings, and this, he's not saying these are innate ideas put into the heads of human beings by nature or anything of this kind. All he's saying is that because of our experience, all humans have a certain feeling in the what others are experiencing. In other words, the two terms he often uses, joys and suffering. So if one sees another human being suffer, then one feels a certain sympathy for that person. There's a fellow feeling. Similarly, if one sees somebody who is obviously happy and delighted, one similarly feels joyful. Why does this happen? Now, Smith is only attributing this to experience, and he goes into how this experience or how this sentiment is produced out of experience. And here he goes on to say it's not just that we see something and we simply react to that sight. Sympathy arises from the situation in which we see the other. Even when the other does not have the same feeling. Now, this is a very interesting argument, okay? So what he's saying is that we actually can never feel what the other is feeling. So we see, as he said, though our brother is upon the rack, so the brother is being beaten up. Now, we cannot actually feel directly what the person who's being beaten up is feeling. That is impossible, right? All we can do is imagine. We put ourselves in the position of that person and imagine what he or she may be feeling. Okay? It is by imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. Neither can that faculty help us to this any other way than by representing to us what would be our own if we were in his case. So what we do is we put ourselves in that position. In other words, we try to imagine what we would feel if we were being beaten up in the same way. Okay? That is what produces the feeling of sympathy. But it's more complicated than that. Okay? Because now, there is an interesting problem here that Smith is raising. He is arguing that when we see somebody else in a particular condition of suffering or happiness, we actually try to inquire into the situation that produces this condition. So, for instance, imagine we see someone on the street who's crying desperately. Now, Smith says our immediate reaction is to first inquire what has happened to this person that he or she should be crying in this way. We try to find that out. Okay? Sometimes we will find it out. And if that situation seems something so particularly tragic or maybe, it could be an accident, it could be a death that has happened to someone else, it could be some great loss that this person had suddenly suffered. And once we understand or know the situation, we put ourselves in that situation by imagining it. And once we imagine it, we then get a certain feeling, right? We imagine what we would feel if that same misfortune had come upon us. And that is what produces the feeling of sympathy. Now, there is more. Think of a situation, and I'm constructing this is not Smith's. Think of a situation where we see a man who's very angry, and so angry, in fact, that he is beating up another person in great anger and shouting and so on. Again, in a situation like this, how would we react? If we follow Smith, our tendency would be to first ask, what has happened? Why is this person so angry? And depending on the answer, we would either sympathize with the person who is angry and beating up the other, or we may sympathize with the person who is being beaten. So think of a situation where, for instance, we find that the person who is actually the aggressor, that we see as the aggressor, was in fact being robbed by the other person, right? Somebody was trying to pick his pocket for him, perhaps. And he's caught the person, and so he's angry and beating up. Now, in a situation like this, as we know, we'll not only sympathize with the person who was being robbed. As we know, in a situation like this, most people would have joined in the beating of this supposed thief, right? It's a very standard reaction we see on the streets. But supposing we find out that the person who was being beaten was in fact an employee of the other person, and that this employee had not been paid for several months, and he had only come to ask for his dues, and the employer was beating up the employee because he was asking for money. Now, in a situation like this, we may well sympathize with the employee, right? Now, so it's not simply, so therefore, this is the next step that Smith is taking in this discussion of sympathy. What does sympathy involve? It involves then our putting ourselves in the position of the person that we see. And then, based on how we would feel in that situation, we make a judgment on whether or not we would be sympathetic, right? We can well react not in sympathy, but in disgust, we may choose to ignore. All of these things are possible. But the key argument here is that we put ourselves in the position of the other person. That is the first key move that Smith is making here. He then makes a very interesting argument about death and what we feel when we see death. Smith says that when we see a dead person, again, we try and put ourselves in the position of that dead person. We put ourselves in the position of that dead person and feel, and this is what produces in us the fear of death. Even though in this case, of course, the dead person is not feeling anything at all, right? This is again Smith's very keen observation here. The dead person is beyond all feelings. But we nevertheless imagine ourselves in the position of the dead and then feel that something has happened to that dead person, which is most most grievous, right? So, in fact, Smith then says this very interesting phrase: it's the illusion of the imagination which produces in us the fear of death. Not only that, it compels us to behave in a proper manner, even when the dead person has ceased to have feeling. So, in the presence of a dead person, we all behave in a particular way. We try to be decorous, to not to behave in an immoderate way, because we feel it would be, as we say, it would be disrespectful to the dead. Now, of course, here once again, what Smith is emphasizing, the dead person is not feeling anything at all. The dead person is not seeing what's going around after the person is already dead. We imagine ourselves in the position of the dead, right? And then we sense that if we were there in that position and we could see what was going on, we would not want, right, to see people behaving disrespectfully or behaving improperly. And this illusion of the imagination induces us to behave in the proper way. Now, all of this is important because you can see that Smith, in trying to establish a certain fundamental set of, we could call it behavioral, this is not a term that Smith would have used, a certain behavioral code, a pattern of social behavior, right, by which sociability, fellow feeling is established in society, right? This foundation, Smith is seeking not in some logically established, rationally established universal principle of reason. He is trying to look for it in the actual behavior of people, in the way people actually act through experience, through the way they have been brought up in society. That is to say, they've been brought up in relations with others, in carrying out their relations with others. It is in that context, in that situation, learned through experience, that people behave in a moral way. This will be the key argument in Smith in this idea of moral sentiments. What is morality? What's the moral way of behaving? Smith is looking for the answer in the actual experience of people. This is the strong empiricist basis of Smith's inquiry. Okay, what's happened here? Okay, now Smith goes on. People follow established rules of behavior even when not inclined to do so. They act as if their hearts were inclined. This is a product of virtuous education. Now, this again is a very interesting move that Smith is making. He is saying And I've given you this illustration. This is again, obviously not from Smith's time, traffic signs. Okay, Smith, Edinburgh or Glasgow did not have traffic signs, obviously. But supposing we were to take this example, why do we follow traffic signs? Following Smith's reasoning, we would say that we do so even when we are not particularly inclined to follow such rules, but we nevertheless do so. And we nevertheless do so because we have been taught to follow them. So we act as if we were doing so voluntarily, we were doing so because we were persuaded of the reasonings and so on and so forth. This is a product of virtuous education. It is because we have been taught in a particular way to follow rules that we do so. It's not because we have thought through the reasonings behind these traffic rules, right? And we have all come to accept that reason. We simply act as if we understood the rules and we follow them, right? So here again, Smith is basically looking for patterns of social behavior, right, that are not dependent on people actually understanding the foundations, the rational foundations of rules. They follow rules because they have simply been taught to follow rules. Virtuous education. Now, and they do so not just accidentally, they do so as a matter of habit, regular habit. Now, this is where there is the third argument. If they did not follow established rules of behavior, society would crumble. Now, what Smith is saying is that people don't actually reason this way when they follow rules. So when I choose to stop at a red sign, right, or cross the street only when the sign says I should cross the street, right, I am not necessarily thinking that if I did not do so, society would crumble, right? I could very well have the temptation to say, well, there are no cars anyway, so why shouldn't I cross? And let me confess, sometimes I do cross that way, even when there were no cars, right? But most of the time, most people behave as if they understood the reason. And they do so because, once again, as Smith says, they follow established rules of social behavior. The result, of course, is that if people did follow established rules, if they were educated in the proper way, if habits and customs were in fact well established, then society does not crumble. Society operates in a coherent way where people are able to cooperate. Even though, as I said, this cooperation happens, there's one very interesting term that Smith would use, the invisible hand, which is making its appearance here. We will come across it even later. The key idea in Smith is that the functioning of society, the coordinated functioning of society, is not the result of every individual actually reasoning the requirements, reasoning out the requirements for coordinated social functioning and then acting accordingly. They do not think this way at all. All they do is follow the established procedures of custom. The result will be the coordinated function of society. Okay, so this is the key idea in Smith here. Why it is empirical. So if one were to come across a society which seemed chaotic, right, where people were not apparently following rules, where society did not seem to have a very coherent character, we would be able to compare that with another society which was coherent, right? And simply then come to the conclusion that in one case, there were well-established customs, habits, which were carried through with the help of a certain system of education. And in the other case, the chaotic case, these customs and habits were not well established, and perhaps there was not a sufficiently well-developed system of virtuous education. And hence, we would be able to compare these two sorts of societies. We will come across this idea in Smith again. Questions? Now, what is the way in which these rules actually become customary, right? How are these social rules or moral rules conveyed to people, and the importance of following those rules impressed upon their minds? And here Smith introduces the idea of religion as the key institution that produces these customary rules of morality. But you will see Smith's appeal to religion is not to make the case that religion contains the truth, some universal truth of social life. Okay, Smith is using the religion idea more as a kind of functional institution. Religion here is functional. It helps produce this coherent sense of customary rules that people will follow. Okay, people think of rules of morality as commands of the deity. If in fact people were made to believe that rules of morality were in fact given to them by God, they would be far more inclined to obey them. Right? So, societies where this kind of religious instruction was prevalent, you would normally see people obeying rules of morality because they feared the disobedience of laws as the disobedience of divine laws, divine commands, right? How does this happen? And once again, Smith goes back to a certain stages of development idea, stages of social development. First, impressed by nature, pagan superstition ascribed the passions of human nature to the gods. Natural hopes, fears, and suspicions led people to believe that the gods were the rewarders of humanity and the avengers of injustice, right? Pagan superstition. So you go back to ancient society, uh, pagan meaning pre-Christian, idolatrous, um, polytheist, all of those things. And pagan society in the European case would mean ancient Greece, ancient Rome, all of these were pagan. Pagan superstition ascribed the passions of human nature to the gods. So why did people, for instance, kill one another? Why did they rob one another? Why did they deceive one another? All of these were seen to be immoral acts. How did this happen? Well, they often attributed these passions to gods, and we don't have gods, spirits, etc. So we would say some spirit inhabited this person and made the person act in this violent way, right? Some god decided to punish this person through the violent act of somebody else. Now, all of these things were possible because, in fact, passions were attributed to the acts, to the interventions of gods. There were many gods. Sometimes gods fought with one another, where human beings became their instruments. All of these things, we know this from stories of mythology. I mean, for instance, Indian mythology is full of stories of this kind. So natural hopes, fears, and suspicions led people to believe that the gods were the rewarders of humanity and the avengers of injustice. Now, those societies where the acts of gods were finally reduced to gods who rewarded goodness in human beings, right? And avenged or punished injustice. Those kinds of societies, ancient societies, pagan societies, moral rules became customary. People acted in moral ways because they believed that the gods would look after them, that if they acted in a good way, gods would reward them. If they acted in a bad way, what was understood to be the bad, customarily understood to be the bad behavior, would be punished by the gods. The terrors of natural religion, so these were the terrors of natural religion, were later confirmed by philosophical researchers. Now, what Smith is describing here is that the later understandings in civilized society, so you first have this in pagan society, ancient pagan society, where everything is attributed to the terrors and good deeds of the gods. In civilized society, in developed religion, of course, here Smith is obviously referring to Christianity and perhaps even Protestant Christianity, which is the most recent and in Smith's time, the most clearly, most developed form of the Christian religion as understood by the, the members of the Scottish Enlightenment, right? The philosophical researchers basically confirmed this idea that God would reward. God, of course, here you have a clearly monotheistic God. God would reward good deeds and punish evil deeds. This produced the moral faculty in human beings. Now, go back to the idea in Hume that human beings were simply a bundle of experiences. There were many experiences, many kinds of experiences, right? And each of these experiences or sets of experiences produced certain kinds of principles of action. So there were principles of action which had to do with, let us say, buying and selling is one kind. Let us say family relations is another kind. Relations with neighbors could be another kind. There could be a whole set of relations with peoples and things, each of which the kind of behavior will be dictated by the specific kinds of experiences that people have gone through. The moral faculty is unlike those other faculties because it judges between different principles of our nature. And then Smith makes a very interesting observation, or at least formulates in this way. What is the form of punishment in advanced society, the most advanced form of civilized society? The vice regions of God within us. Okay, and here Smith is clearly making the assumption that as far as people like him or people in, let us say, Scottish society or British society of his time is concerned, they do not expect God to appear and actually act in particular ways to reward or punish. Right? So how is it that in a society like that, in civilized society, advanced civilized society, and as we'll see, he's actually clearly speaking of commercial society, the most advanced societies of his time, how did people behave morally? Right? What impelled people to behave morally? The vice regions of God within us. It's as if this is the moral faculty we have in us. It's developed through experience, through education. It punishes the violation of moral laws by torments of inward shame and reward obedience with contentment and self-satisfaction. So he is actually then, this is a very, very Protestant idea, as you will recognize. It's the idea of conscience, individual conscience, right? But individual conscience here is not on the basis, is not given through some universal principle of reason, right? It is acquired through experience, through education, through custom. But that impels us to listen to the moral faculty within us. He's calling them the vice regions of God within us. What happens is that if we do something wrong, something we know to be wrong, even if we were not punished publicly by others, we would still feel inward shame, the torments of inward shame. And on the other hand, if we, in a particularly difficult situation, for instance, in the face of the great Protestant dilemma, in the face of temptation, right? How do we act morally? If we succeed in behaving morally, we are filled with contentment and self-satisfaction. Okay, so this is the way in which Smith describes moral behavior in advanced society where there is religion, but this is not like ancient religion. Okay, people do not necessarily believe that gods or God will actually appear, intervene, right, and punish the bad people and reward the good people. There is an inward working of the moral faculty, which is cultivated, as it were, through education and through moral instruction. And this produces what otherwise, I don't think Smith actually uses the word conscience, but this is what we understand as conscience. The individual conscience here now rules, and this is what he's calling the moral faculty, which judges between the different activities of our nature in different aspects. Now, and here Smith will point out various incommensurabilities, various ways in which the natural and moral order are not always do not always concur, right? Natural rewards for different virtues are often not the same as moral ordering of rewards. And the example Smith gives is that think of the industrious knave, a person who is actually a very immoral person, right? A thoroughly disreputable person. And yet that person is industrious, right? Works hard. Nature will reward the bad person who works hard, cultivates his land, yields a good crop, right? And earns a lot. Nature will reward that person because nature will reward the virtue of industry, even though that person is maybe morally a thoroughly despicable person. While the indolent good man is not rewarded. Someone we know to be a good person, but is lazy, right? Nature will not reward that person. Now, Smith says, human sensibility wants to reward the good man. Man is by his nature directed to correct natural inequities. So the unfairness of nature can be extremely unfair. So some people are strong, some people are weak, right? People have many natural infirmities. And because of these reasons, nature may not reward these people the same as others. Now, the human faculty, moral faculty, will actually say, well, these people are being punished for no fault of theirs. If somebody had a natural infirmity and is therefore unable to work in the same way that others do, and because of this, that person does not get the rewards from nature that other people do. Nature will not correct that injustice, that unfairness. It is for humans then to correct it. And human sensibility will be impelled to correct this. So in a sense, what happens, and this is Smith's argument, that human morality, moral sentiments, will correct natural inequities, injustice, right? It is part of human nature. So think of this. I mean, the complications of this argument. There is nature and there is human nature. Okay? Nature itself can produce many unfair outcomes. Human nature then proceeds to correct those natural unfair outcomes. This becomes an important aspect of what Smith will call the moral order produced by the sentiment of sympathy. It is for our sympathy, once again, put ourselves in the position of this person who has natural infirmities. If I were in that position, how would I feel? Right? And that impels us then to move to correct that natural injustice. Here again, he brings in the role of religion in supporting the natural sense of duty and our obligation to others in society. Vice is often not punished by humans, but it will be by God. Hence, vice is not in one's self-interest, even if society offers the opportunity. This is where Smith is moving one step forward to talk about the functional role of religion in commercial society. Here, clearly, Smith has moved from the stage of, what he's calling pagan superstition. Commercial society. In commercial society, one knows that, for instance, the dealings of trade, there are many opportunities to deceive others. Okay? Think of all of those things we consider to be acts of fraud, of deception, of corruption. All of these are characteristic precisely of commercial society. Okay, I come to an agreement with somebody to supply a certain commodities of a certain quality. I supply inferior things. And there is a possibility that I will not be found out. So this vice will not be punished by humans. And so I profit from it. But this is where religion, through its education, will teach people that I may profit from dishonest trade, but God will punish me, right? That perhaps there is some afterlife where I will be punished, or some great disaster will befall me or my family or whatever. And God, this dishonest behavior will be punished. This is what religion will teach. And so the natural sense of duty, of obligations to others, of trust, all of those things which are absolutely crucial for commercial society to function properly are helped, reinforced by religion or religious instruction, which teaches people that even if one gets away with dishonest behavior in social life, one will not get away from the judgment of God. Okay, that is why religion, in a sense, is functionally consistent with the outcomes of commercial society, with the desirable outcomes of commercial society. Now, another very interesting, and of course, this is an argument we are already familiar with from The Wealth of Nations. Remember, this book is written several years before The Wealth of Nations. So this is 1759, Wealth of Nations is 1776. But one of the sort of basic ideas is already introduced here, and this is the deception that luxuries and conveniences of the rich are desirable. That keeps industry in motion. So the rich desire more and more luxury. This is far beyond what they actually need. All right? But the rich keep desiring and acquiring more and more wealth in order to satisfy their craving for luxuries. Now, in some basic sense, you could say this is vice. This is immoral. But because of this craving for greater and greater luxuries, industry moves ahead. How do the rich indulge in these luxuries? By greater and greater profits, by seeking greater and greater profits from their industry. And because that induces them to improve industry, to expand them, the rich are led by an invisible hand to distribute necessaries of life more equally. So, going back to the argument Smith we have already seen in Smith, in the later Smith, all they do is satisfy their fancies, but in so doing, they provide for the needs of the poor. Right? Once again, what he's pointing out is not necessarily some rational principle of universal morality. What he's pointing out is how the actual understanding of what is moral behavior, right, as developed or acquired through experience, has social effects or social consequences. In this case, what apparently seems to be a not very appropriate fancy for luxurious things, right, which certainly in terms of medieval religion would have been condemned, right? But in the context of commercial society, once again, look, observe that this is once again a very contextual argument, that in the context of commercial society, the craving for luxuries that the rich have is actually functional, that it actually produces, through its social effects, right, greater benefits for the poor. Finally, let's come to the question of social development, which again, Ferguson, who was younger than Smith, has a whole, the history of civil society is really a stages of development argument. But in Smith too, we have this argument from hunting society, which is the society of savages, to pastoral herding society, to agricultural society, to commercial society. This is a basic framework of development which will persist. This is from the late 18th century. The Scottish Enlightenment thinkers introduced this. This would perceive through the 19th and even the 20th century, so that even when, let's say, the discipline of anthropology would develop from the 19th century onwards into the 20th, this would be a very basic form of stages of development argument that would persist all the way through. Even with, after the Darwinian understandings of evolution, evolutionary theory would be, social Darwinism, for instance, would be built into this stages argument. But the stages argument, this sequence of hunter-gatherers to pastoral, to agricultural, to industrial. Smith does not use the term industrial society. That comes later in the 19th century. Commercial society, we would call it industrial society from the 19th century onwards. This stages of development argument persists. What happens through these stages? This is that last chapter of the book that I had asked you to read. Now, this is where Smith is introducing an idea that morality is relative to the particular stage of development of society. What you must look for is what is normal in a particular society at a particular time and place. Normal is the average or the mean. So Smith is already making and this is a very fundamental empiricist argument. For instance, this argument about, let's say, the conscience of people, okay? The moral conscience. People follow moral rules. Now, it does not mean that everybody follows moral rules, right? Even in commercial society or in civilized society, there are people who do not, okay? The question is, what is the average or the mean, the normal? This normal varies according to time and place. Among civilized nations, and this is where Smith makes various observations which are sort of like anthropological generalizations. Among civilized nations, humanity is more cultivated, right? People are more sophisticated. They behave in a more cultivated manner. Their speech, their dress, their food, all of these are more cultivated and sophisticated. Among savages, self-denial is more cultivated. So humanity is more cultivated among civilized nations. Self-denial is more cultivated among savages. So what he's calling savage society or hunting or even pastoral society, right? The more meritorious, the more virtuous person is the one who denies various comforts or pleasures that others find attractive. So self-denial is more virtuous, whereas among civilized nations, humanity someone who actually, let's say, is is a great host, someone who entertains, someone who throws lavish feasts, is considered more virtuous and sociable than others. This is because security and prosperity are more common in civilized society, and hence it is, people are not threatened by showing their wealth or entertaining in a lavish way. Whereas in earlier forms of society, showing wealth actually could constitute a threat, could be dangerous. Okay, so people do not behave or express cultivate their wealth or their social privileges, and rather they try and deny those kinds of comforts. Civilized people are more animated towards one another. Savages are more severe and restrained. And civilized people are more frank, savages more dishonest. Now, many of these observations we can easily demolish. These are not, properly speaking, based on very serious ethnographic observations. He's simply referring to this or that travelogue, or he was well-read person, but this somebody describing the manners of, let us say, some North American, Native American tribe, or something like that. These are the sorts of examples that Smith gives, and you can easily, dismiss them. What is interesting and important is the way in which Smith actually tries to understand the significance of particular moral codes or practices in the specific context of specific societies. In other words, once again, he is not making any claims about universal moral rules. What he's suggesting is that moral rules are relative or functional to particular societies. And one very striking example he gives is the killing of infants is a practice common among savages. And the reason is, he says, and he gives these examples from ancient Greece, where, for instance, if there's an invasion, an attack on a city, and people are running away, and if you are running away, very often infants are a hindrance because they can't keep up. It's difficult to carry infants. It's difficult to feed them. And very often, in a situation like this in ancient Greece, there are many descriptions of this, where children were simply abandoned, left to die, as it were, and as their parents and others ran away. Smith says this would be completely unacceptable among civilized people. We would be horrified when we read about or hear about incidents like this. But in that particular context, it is difficult to criticize this practice because, in fact, you could argue, it was absolutely crucial for the survival of the rest of the people, right? And so what you get is a functionalist theory of moral practices, a functionalist theory. What is functional to a particular society, rather than any general universal principle. I think we can, if there are questions, please, because I've given you the basic arguments in at least those sections of the book that I'd asked you to read. What is important, as I said at the very beginning, is to understand the basic intellectual foundation of Smith's approach to social inquiry, to social knowledge about society. And that intellectual foundation was not the sorts of things we'll see later on through the 19th century, particularly following the interventions of major German philosophers like Kant and Hegel, and on to Marx, for instance, where there would be an attempt to try and develop universal sorts of rules, universal principles of social organization, which apply everywhere, right? And can be logically derived from certain first principles. Smith's arguments in The Wealth of Nations, as I said, would be reduced to those kinds of propositions later on. But in Smith's own times and in his own intellectual environment, that was not the approach that was typical of the Scottish Enlightenment. It was far more empiricist, it was far more contextual, and it depended very much upon a certain stages of society argument, which made even moral principles relative to particular social contexts, and which emphasized in particular the force of custom, habit, and often backed by religious as the main forces that created the bonds of social life around which society, even modern society, was built. Okay. Questions now? No questions?
Partha, there is a question on YouTube, but I'm not very sure whether it's not very clear to me, but I'll just read it out anyway. Says, sir, could you please say something on the commercial society? The division of labor promotes a kind of collective labor instead of individual labor. I'm not quite sure, the syntax, but
no, this actually commercial society and the division of labor. We discussed this at length in the first class. In the first class, there is no collective labor argument at all. In fact, the key idea in Smith about commercial society is that each individual in commercial society only pursues self-interest, what is good for oneself. Nobody thinks of the good of other people. It is through the mutual exchange in the market and the division of labor, right? And the key argument, of course, there is that the market should not be captured by any one or a small group of people. There should be numerous producers coming into the market. In a situation like that, an invisible hand, as it were, the effect would be that everyone's needs would be satisfied through that exchange in the market. The labor is actually directed through self-interest. And as everyone is a producer who employs some laborers, but then there are numerous such producers who go into the market and exchange. Whatever is the product of their labor. In Marx's argument, of course, and that would be a very, very crucial shift. What happens when there is a substantial population which does not have any means of labor at all? In other words, those who have no land or no implements of craft, they simply have the capacity to labor, to work, but they have nothing to work on. They have no capital, in other words, they have no property of their own. What happens then? And this, of course, becomes the classic situation in modern industrial society, where some people have the capital, right? And others simply have the capacity to work. So they come to the marketplace, and the laborer or the industrial worker, in other words, exchanges what is his only property, which is the capacity to work, the labor power, as Marx would call it, and sells that labor power. The industrialist, who now becomes the capitalist, the owner of capital, buys that labor power in the market like one would buy any other commodity, and hence produce, and the output is entirely the product, the property of the owner of the factory. So this would become the new form of industrial production. This is not something Adam Smith had anticipated. Smith was still describing a rise of industrial production in its very early stages in the 1770s. And so there is, everyone is, as it were, a producer, and there is perfect competition in the marketplace. But there is no collective labor.
I think Rajarshi, you have a hand up.
Yeah. Partha, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So my question is about your exposition on David Hume particularly, and the Scottish Enlightenment, the philosophical background to Scottish Enlightenment in general. So my question is, see, if one studies historians of science such as, say, Laurent Duston and others, so they talk about this, the very contingent beginnings of the what was going to have a profound impact on European intellectual milieu was that of the intervention of Francis Bacon.
Yes.
And that was singularly responsible for the decline of a certain Aristotelian practices of scientific thought, certain Aristotelian practices of philosophical thought. And there was a shift towards more empirical lines of reasoning. And you also mentioned how the observability of a phenomena was being foregrounded in Hume as well. So what I want to really curious to know is what was this line of thought between Bacon and, say, people like Hume?
Well, see, as far as Bacon is concerned, that is for good 100 years before. It's the 17th century. And about Bacon, there's the great debate between Bacon and Hobbes. which happened, and that, in a sense, was absolutely crucial in terms of explaining what the divergence was. The divergence was between a Hobbesian way of thinking, which basically said that all true knowledge, even of nature, had to proceed axiomatically from certain basic assumptions, right? Certain key assumptions, and then the principles had to be derived from those, or deduced from those key axioms. The appeal to the real world, and certainly the question of experiments, was simply anathema to Hobbes. This was, his argument was, this is no way to gather knowledge, because what you see from experiments was simply, these are simply accidental particularities. How can you deduce general laws from these kinds of specific observations, particular observations? Bacon, on the other hand, really introduces the idea of experiments, create a condition in the laboratory, right, where you can actually observe, as though it was in a court of law, right? You can actually observe nature as a witness. Nature gives witness to you. That is the evidence that you will get once you are able to set up a natural conditions, artificially create a certain set of natural conditions which you want to observe in the laboratory. Now, this becomes initially a debate, but as we know, by the 18th century, there is no debate really on this, because both forms of scientific reasoning become well established. On the one hand, you have the theoretical sciences, right? Physics, chemistry, all of these have theoretical sciences where there is a body of knowledge which consists of universal laws, so-called laws of nature, right? Law-like propositions, which are supposed to hold for nature everywhere. You also have a set of practical experimentation by which these natural laws can be tested experimentally, their truths ascertained. If there are deviations, then those so-called laws come into question, right? And over time, various so-called natural laws are in fact revised, modified, new laws are introduced, are discovered, all through confirmation, right? Experimentally. Now, both those two things become part of the discipline of the physical sciences all the way to this day. The debate that we see in the Scottish Enlightenment case is an early form of this. As I said, the question of what is social knowledge, right, is not necessarily resolved through the argument of the 18th century, the 17th century debates about nature, right? About society, the crucial argument was, and this is something that develops, again, from the 17th century onwards, where the arguments are made about human nature, that human beings too are, in a sense, natural creatures, and therefore there are certain innately natural, law-like aspects or characteristics of human behavior. This is one assumption. So, for instance, when you think of Hobbes, Hobbes speaks about this innate human nature to protect one's life and property, right? It's supposed to be innate in human nature. the innate human liberties that one possessed in the state of nature before there is any state or any laws, right? Everyone is naturally endowed with freedom. These are supposed to be properties of nature, just like any other property of nature. This is what certainly Hume and many of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers begin to question by saying that there are no innate, naturally endowed qualities that are given to human beings. These are acquired through experience, right? And this is the empiricist basis. The debates will come up much more strongly in the 19th century when you will have debates, and these again are debates which run all the way through to our times in the various social disciplines. What are the universal laws of society? Are there any universal laws of society? And what is the role of actual human experience? Does human behavior necessarily conform to universal laws? These are debates that still continue, right? So, for instance, assumptions in economics about the rational consumer. Now, a large number of theoretical models and so on have been built on the basis of the assumption of the rational individual. But do individuals in actual market society behave in this rational way? Actual experience seems to often suggest that not. What happens then to our social knowledge? That is this debate between the empiricists and the rational theorists. This continues in social theory even today.
If I may ask a second question, Partha.
Yeah.
So, where you see, would you say that Ferguson, in a way, right, where you were talking about him not being a very progressivist thinker, would you say that in a sense Ferguson's idea of societies were quite running parallel to what Herder would argue?
Who would argue?
Herder, somebody like Herder would argue?
I haven't thought about that.
I mean, the Herder's whole argument about how each society is characterized by its own genus and
no. See, it's different to the extent that Herder actually has, because Herder obviously would then move into essentially arguing that each nation, as it were, and the idea of nation is very strong there. Each nation has certain inherent characteristics which develop through that nation's history. Ferguson is, unlike Herder, does not make distinctions between nations which are at the same stage of civilization. You see, Ferguson's principal argument is about stages of civilization, about less developed and more developed stages. And at each stage, his argument would be that if you think of commercial societies, there are characteristics of commercial society which would be the same, irrespective of which nation those commercial cities belong. You would have those characteristics everywhere. Civilized societies, for instance, and Ferguson's this book, it's the essay on civil society, actually has most of the examples are, of course, European, from different European and including ancient Europe. He does have examples of so-called savage society, borrowed from various travel accounts of Europeans in the Americas mainly, but also some in the Middle East. I don't remember if China or India actually come up. Perhaps they do too. I don't actually remember. But the arguments are that, for instance, civilized society, certain kinds of patterns of behavior you will find in civilized society everywhere. Similarly, in so-called savage society, there are certain kinds of behavior you will find everywhere. Because fundamentally, there is a certain functionalism which operates in Ferguson, just as it does in Smith, that certain kinds of patterns of behavior are functional to that stage of civilization. And you are likely to find them no matter which national region it comes from.
Thanks a lot, Partha.
Okay. All right. So what we are doing next week, we'll go to Marx, right? That correct? Next week is Marx on the Jewish question. Right.
11th October, Partha.
11, oh, sorry, it's not next week. Yeah,
Yeah.
we are after 2
that's
weeks.
the Jewish
We
question,
have a gap of 2 weeks. 11th October, correct. Right. All right then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Partha.
You have to take your take the attendance.
No, they all attended.
Okay. Good. Thank you then.
Thank you. Thank you.